Let me say a few words first about Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO, this outstanding genius of 18th century Italy. He was born in the year 1707, which is a very significant date in Jewish history because it comes after the traumas of the 1600s with the false messiah movement of Shabbatai Tzvi that had ravaged whole communities with apostates and a whole lot of troubles. And that had followed the terrible Khmelnytsky massacres in Ukraine and Poland in the late 1640s. So here into Italy in 1707, God put one of the outstanding souls of Israel, an absolute genius, a child prodigy. Many people have heard of Rabbi Elijah the Gaon of Vilna, who lived a little after Ramachal, who said that had he lived in his days, he would have walked all the way from Lithuania to Italy just to sit at his feet. As a child, he was a master of mathematics, logic, Talmud, mysticism, and poetry, drama. He wrote dramas that were performed. He was at a time in Italy of the tremendous flourishing of reason and the pursuit of harmony and truth. And at the age of 18, his weekly sermons in his synagogue in Padua in Italy were attended by up to 500 people. Now, he had a circle of his Haverim, which are in some ways comparable to the Haverim of the teacher of the Holy Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that were sworn to never let a moment, day or night, go without one of them in devotion and study. And it was said that in the Bet Midrash, in the study hall of Rabbi Moshe Chaim, this 18-year-old genius, the spirit of Elijah would dwell, that the Avot, the patriarchs, would speak through his mouth. And he began writing a series of very exalted Kabbalistic writings. Well, now this sent shudders through the established rabbinic circles of Italy, who feared that here is another false messiah about to, like a highly charismatic young person who's going to do heaven knows what after the ravages already suffered. So the rabbis began to persecute him. They insisted that he has to burn his writings. They must, eventually he was forced through this persecution to leave Italy, and he went to live in Amsterdam in Holland, which in those days was a more liberal and a calm, cool environment where he wrote some of his most outstanding works. But already at the age of 22, when this controversy was raging around him, when he was still living in Italy, that was precisely when he wrote the amazing book that we're going to be speaking about in more detail today, his unraveling of the mystery of Ezekiel's prophecy of the coming temple, the ultimate temple. So while this controversy was raging around him, he was writing this book in which he was unfolding the mysteries of the divine names and how they're manifested in the structure of the Holy Temple, which only a complete genius could have done. Nobody else in the whole literature of Kabbalah and Torah had ever done this. And when he subsequently moved to Amsterdam, that was when he wrote his most famous work, The Path of the Just, which is a 10-step program to holiness and righteousness, based upon a Mishnaic teaching of the 10 stages to holiness. He elaborated in 10 sections where he describes stage by stage the spiritual ascent that should be attained, striven for by everybody. And this has become the most universally accepted classic of Torah writings on moral self-perfection, the Mesilat Yesharim, the Path of the Just. In those years in Amsterdam, he also composed works on the Kabbalah that have been compared in their contribution to the writings of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the Rambam on the law of the Torah. Rambam, also called Moshe, Moses, had completely systematized the whole law of the Torah in his 14-volume Mishnah Torah, the Yad Chazakah, the mighty arm of the law. Well, Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO did the same for the Kabbalah. He took the writings of the Zohar, the writings of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria of the 1500s, the Kabbalistic genius of Tzfat, and he made order in the concepts and gave a ladder of ascent into these mysteries in his perfectly lucid and eloquently written books. So he should be considered one of the outstanding Kabbalistic and mystical geniuses of the modern age. Rabbi Elijah, the Gaon of Vilna, considered that Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO and Rabbi Yitzhak Luria of 1600 Tzfat and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, were on a plane. And he lived in mystery, he died in mystery. At the end of his life, he left Holland and he came to Israel in times when the journeys were very perilous. And he most certainly saw himself as having the soul of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva, who is known to have been the child of Gerim, of converts, was descendant of people who came from Italy. And it is said that Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO had to live in Italy in order to make a repair for Rabbi Akiva and the soul of Rabbi Akiva. So when he came to Israel, he lived in the town of Acre in north of Haifa in Israel, and he died of the plague in 1747. Lived intensely and died very young at the age of 40 years old, and was buried according to different versions, either in a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery near Acre, which is now in the Druze city of Kfar Yusuf, or according to other versions, actually next to the very amazing site of the burial cave of Rabbi Akiva in the hills west of Tiberias, where you have a magnificent view of the whole Kinneret, Sea of Tiberias, and where it is thought that Rabbi Akiva was actually martyred when he was burned at stake by the Romans. So without question, Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO is one of the, to many people, unknown outstanding giants of the modern age, and a guide for us in our age. The aspiration of every Torah observant Jew is to follow the Torah with all our heart and with all our soul. And that is a pathway that has been trodden from generation to generation. We must continue to tread. There can be no compromise on truth, on abstaining from petty thieving, from bad mouthing, and from many, many other human failings. And if nobody steps up and reminds you of this, society is in a very bad way. And we do see that in the world today, where the whole moral fiber of Western civilization is falling apart. Anything goes. If you feel like it, do it, as long as you don't stand for faith in God. That you're not allowed to talk about, but everything else you can talk about. So his writings have molded generations of very pious Jews, of rabbis, of their students and teachers. Until today, the first and the classic work of Musar, of moral perfection, which any student studies, is Mesilat Yesharim, the path of the just. So, and that is because he didn't innovate a new pathway. What he did was to systematize the pathway that is scattered around in a comment here or a comment there across the Talmud and the other writings. But the clarity and the lucidity with which he presents it to us is something that unquestionably has relevance for our time. Now, I think that his Kabbalistic writings are of also tremendous importance, because they unlock a whole world of thought and spirituality to everyone. He writes on the Kabbalah with a clarity which is unparalleled, and this is a tremendously deep subject. So it is his ability to throw light on the meaning of these concepts that makes his works for people who are searching for the truth about a correct worldview will find in his writings the mental concepts that are needed to begin to grasp this. Now, I also believe that one of his books, which we're going to talk about in detail today, has not only a miraculous history, but a primary importance in the world we live in. Nobody knew about this book except in a list of books that Rabbi Moshe Chaim had written, but these were books that were written by hand, in many cases were not printed in his lifetime, and they were probably kept in boxes of some kind, and many of them were probably lost. Well, in 1956, a professor from the Hebrew University was sitting in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England, and was looking through scrolls, and he opened up a particular scroll and was reading it, and was very intrigued to read an explanation of the form of the temple. And the more he read from his knowledge of writings of Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO that were known, there was no question that this was the missing manuscript on the form of the temple, which they had tried to ban and destroy in the 1720s. And here it was in the Bodleian Library, forgotten, one copy of it. So Rabbi Yishaya Tishby, the professor, made this known to his colleagues and came to the hands of Rabbi Chaim Friedlander, who was one of the deans of the Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak in Israel, who published a Hebrew edition in which he laboriously worked out the many issues that there are with written manuscripts, and also provided very brief commentary elucidating the work. Now, this is a work that has become known among leading rabbis. I heard a story from a Lubavitcher Sephardic rabbi from Montreal who was on his way to come to live in Israel, Rabbi Mordechai Shiriki, and he stopped off in the days when the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory was alive, and he told him that, among other things, he was anxious to publish this work on the form of the future temple, and the Rebbe gave him every encouragement, and in their conversation knew sections of the writings of Ramchal by heart. So this shows his significance among leading minds of the Jewish people. Well, the book has started to get out, and in the year 2000, at the time when the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, was preparing to meet with Yasser Arafat in the so-called Camp David talks, I personally, who had become acquainted with these works in the previous few years, felt that there was a tremendous lack of knowledge of what the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is all about. It's a piece of rock, and the prophet Zechariah tells us that Jerusalem will be a stumbling block for all of the nations, and you only have to open up your news media any day of the year, and there it is, the Middle East and Jerusalem, and the tensions around it are there, but nobody knows anything about what the place. Yes, people know there was, some people even doubt that there was a Temple of King Solomon there. The guide to the Temple Mount, published by the Jordanian Waqf police in the 1950s, quite clearly for anybody to see, explains that the site was originally the site of the Temple of King Solomon, which is, of course, at the beginning of Book of Kings and Book of Chronicles, but later editions of the guide have erased these points. And in the international diplomatic and political dimension, people say, yes, this is the holy site to Judaism and to Islam and to Christianity, but nobody at all speaks about why and what it is. And Jews, for thousands of years, have daily been praying about Jerusalem, about the welfare of Jerusalem, the building of Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of the temple. It is one of the commandments of the Torah in the book of Exodus. Ve'osuli mikdosh v'shochanti b'soichom. They must make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell in their midst, a place where the divine dwells. And there's no doubt that Jerusalem is the place. From every verse of the Torah in the 5 books of Moses and in the prophecies and the holy writings, if one has the eyes to see the secrets of these Hebrew letters and words, one can see that an international global center has been what the world once had and is the destiny of the world. But in the Torah world of Judaism, outstanding scholars may well be completely familiar with the dimensions of the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, which is in Scripture. It's in First Book of Kings and in Book of Chronicles. And they will also be familiar with it from the Mishneh tractate that was written some 1800 years ago, actually detailing the entire layout of the Second Temple, the temple built by the generation of Ezra and enhanced by Herod. But there is a section of the prophets that nobody understands anything about, and that is Ezekiel, chapter 40 until the end of Ezekiel chapter 48. Ezekiel had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He was a priest, and he went with the first exile of Judah under King Jechoniah. This was before the temple was actually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. There were stages in the exile. He was among the first exiles. He was actually in Babylon at the time of the destruction of King Solomon's temple. And he knew all about what was going on through prophecy, and he, with Jeremiah, who was his contemporary, his older contemporary, were explaining and interpreting what the people was going through. And his book opens with the vision of the heavens opening up and how the whole divine presence is leaving Jerusalem. And then you have his whole prophecy, all the way the prophecy over the destruction of the nations and the punishments, but and the valley of the dry bones and the 2 sticks coming together in the war of Gog and Magog, chapter 38. In chapter 40, he goes to the world of Jubilee, the world of redemption, and he tells us how he was taken by a wind to the celestial city of Jerusalem, and there he was given a virtual guided tour of a temple which does not correspond to the temple of King Solomon as we find it in Kings, nor does it correspond to the temple built by Ezra and the second temple with Joshua the high priest, and which Maimonides in his Code of Torah Law, in his first chapter of the laws of the temple, Rambam Maimonides in the chapter 1 of Hilchos Beis HaBechiro, he says the temple of Ezekiel has not yet been built and is destined to be built. Now, in the prophetic text of Ezekiel, the details are tremendously precise. This courtyard must be 100 cubits, and a cubit is from here to here. This gate has to be so high and so wide. This wall has to be 5 cubits. That wall has to be 6 cubits. There has to be this chamber and that. All very precise, but very hard to make a picture out of, because it's told to us in bits. You're not quite clear. You need the help of the commentators. Even with the commentators, it's very hard to understand what is to be the form of the future temple, which is prophesied in Micha, which is prophesied in Isaiah, which is prophesied across all the prophets. But along comes this genius, Ramchal, in the 1700s, and applies his mind to these chapters of Ezekiel, and he comes out with 5 chapters in clear rabbinic Hebrew corresponding to the tractate Midot, the measurements of the Second Temple. And Ramchal, in his 5 chapters, sets forth a completely structurally sound explanation of the building and all of its precincts. But then he went a step further, and that is he explained what is the meaning of this building. There's buildings all over the world. There's in Paris, in Rome, in London, in cities across the world, the most amazing structures. But besides the way the architects fantasized, what does the building really mean? What does it say? We've seen how the biggest symbol of the pride of the power of money was just smashed down in a few hours in 2001. What does the building actually tell us? What does it mean? Well, to elucidate this, Ramchal returns to a subject that today is known by many who are interested in esoteric subjects, and that is what is called sacred architecture. Sacred architecture is the planning of a building to express certain truths, like the pediment of a classical Greek building with its perfect triangle. This subject relates to a subject some people know its name, but very few people know its significance. Students of the Hebrew Bible may be aware of something called gematria. Gematria is a method whereby each of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet having a mathematical value, you find mathematical connections expressed in the letters of words in the scriptures. Not many people know that gematria actually is exactly the same word as our geometry, and that geometry is not simply drawing triangles on a piece of paper or on a computer screen, but geometry is precisely what it says: geo, earth, metry, measuring. Geometria, gematria, they're one and the same thing. Most scholars of Hebrew are not aware that the roots of gematria lie in geometry. But geometry is an integral part of the Kabbalah wisdom. In fact, there are those who say that Pythagoras visited Mount Carmel in the time of the prophet Elijah and his academy, and we can see many aspects of Greek philosophy that seem to connect with prophetic and Kabbalistic wisdom. Well, now, there in Italy in the 1700s, with very little hope for a return to the land of Israel by most of the people and the rebuilding of the dreamed of and prayed for temple, this this dazzling torchbrand of Torah fire, Ramchal, explains to us all of the secrets of the prophecy of Ezekiel and the structure of the temple in his, it's about a 30 or 40 page long essay or discourse known as Mishkanei Elyon. Mishkanei Elyon is a phrase in Psalms which means the sanctuaries of the divine, and immediately raises a question: why in the plural? Is there not supposed to be one house in Jerusalem which will be God's house? Well, in the Song of the Red Sea, when Israel at the crossing of the sea prophesied the temple, they spoke about the temple Asher Konenu Yadecha, that your hands have aligned. And konenu, the Hebrew root there in the Song of the Sea in Exodus, has the same is the same root as kavanah, things being in alignment. And this is the foundation of the concept that the earthly temple, the temple of stone in Jerusalem, is actually parallel to the heavenly temple. They are aligned. What happens in the earthly temple is bound up with the workings of the heavenly temple. When there is no temple in Jerusalem. The world is in a state of destruction, and the heavenly temple also is not properly functioning and not sending blessing down into the world. So Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO'S explanation of the form of the temple as described in Ezekiel is an explanation of what is the inner meaning of the mathematical qualities of these courtyards and buildings. And all of this he explains through the science of gematria, which you cannot dispute because these are mathematical equations. And when you show that the divine names of the Torah, the various names of God, and the various description of the attributes of God are actually mathematical expressions that can actually be put into walls and columns and proportions, then you are beginning to penetrate mysteries which are intrinsically beyond our minds, but will show us how through a connection with the temple on earth in Jerusalem, we will be able to be in alignment to receive the blessings from the heavenly spiritual temple. Because the moment you understand that the dimensions of courtyards and walls and buildings are mathematical expressions that are not physical, but they are intellectual and spiritual, you see how the temple itself is the interface and the gateway between the physical world and the spiritual world. And besides explaining the actual layout of the buildings in his work, Mishkanei Elyon, the Sanctuaries of the Supreme, which is I've translated in full with a overview and some commentary in a work called The Secrets of the Future Temple. Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO also explains the spiritual significance of the temple services. We live in a world today where there's a huge controversy in Europe and East Europe, West Europe, in America over shchita, over the traditional slaughtering of animals as brought down in Torah law. And the whole subject of animal sacrifice is one that astonishes and repulses many people at the same time as they won't flinch from diving into another big, thick sirloin steak and another lamb chop and another tasty sort of dish. But a couple of lambs on the altar of the Supreme in Jerusalem, if you tried to do it today, you'd set off an international incident. Well, in The Secrets of the Future Temple, Mishkanei Elyon, the Sanctuaries of the Supreme, Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO explains to us why it is that all of the roots of creation that nourish all of the specific creations, the plants, the trees, the birds, the animals, the fish, how they all come to a kind of nerve center in Jerusalem, and how the rituals in the Torah of God in Leviticus of the daily offerings with the lambs and sometimes the oxen and the wheat and the olive oil and the wine, how these actually nourish all of the different levels of creation, thereby eliciting blessing from above. Well, these are matters of faith. These are matters of belief. I think that the relevance of all this to people today in this world that is crying out for guidance, that is so riven with strife and conflict, I think the most essential lesson is very simple, and that is the geometry of the square. The essential principle of all of the future temple, as explained in Ezekiel, that it is all square. The outer courtyard is square. The inner courtyard is square around a building that is essentially a cube, 100 cubits tall, 100 cubits wide, and 100 cubits deep. A 100 cubit cube, what is the meaning of the square and the cube? Well, this is so simple and so important for the world we live in, where what we are witnessing is, as prophesied in Ezekiel and in Zechariah, of the days of the end of the end times, that one against his brother. Everybody's fighting each other. People are all become terribly territorially chauvinistic at a time when others are wandering across the globe in search of a secure place to live in. There's wars everywhere. There's strife within communities and within groups, within systems, within families, in the home, people going off in all directions. Everything is going off in a different direction. Well, now, the beauty of the square is that everything is in a dynamic balance between right and left. Nobody tries to overstep the boundary of the other. They maintain a distance so that they can interact positively. The same between east and west. East, the sun rises, the giver; west, the receiver of the light. They are in a dynamic balance where nobody oversteps their boundaries. Everybody functions within their allotted boundaries. Everybody functions within their allotted boundaries, and that way everything stays in balance. And that is why the city of Jerusalem is called Jerusalem, Yir'ah Shalem, or that is Shalem, that is whole where left and right acknowledge and interact, giver and receiver acknowledge and interact, and that is the key to Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO'S explanation of the future temple, the house whose glory will be above all of the other houses that were before, and which will bring peace to all of the world. What we've been discussing is obviously the New Jerusalem. And so the question arises, is this something that is real as people today understand the word real? Is it actually something we're going to be able to touch and go into and have filmed? Or is it some kind of distant place that maybe one day our souls will apprehend? Well, without any question, a reading of the 5 books of Moses, a reading of the prophecies, and a reading of the holy writings shows that Jerusalem at the end of days is restored. That is precisely where the prophecy of Ezekiel is going to. It's precisely where the prophecy of Zechariah is going to. It's where the prophecy of Micah is going to. And we have not yet seen this happen, so we must believe that it's going to happen. And the reason it has to happen is because God wants his kingdom to be revealed on earth. It's no good running up and down Wall Street and running into to eat and overindulge and everything else, and to say, well, it's all in the prophets, okay, let's eat, drink, and be merry today. The kingdom of God has to dwell in Wall Street and over the way people feed ourselves and the way we lead our lives. And we seem to be very, very far from this point today. And this is not something that can, God forbid, be accomplished by some kind of terror action. It's not something that can be done by war, because you don't build a house of peace through war and through conflict. And with the huge gulf between the different sides and the different viewpoints today, it's quite obvious that the true work of peace and truth can only come at the grassroots. When people begin to wake up and stir, and one person here, for no apparent reason, for no specific cause, suddenly becomes interested in the Bible, in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, in certain ancient teachings that they'd maybe even dismissed before. Why did this suddenly happen somewhere on a farm in Kentucky or somewhere out in the wilds of Texas? Why? Well, God doesn't work the way the New York Times or Fox or CNN present the world. God is operating on every conceivable plane, and we definitely see in our time a growing surge of interest in the Torah, in the prophets, and in the holy writings across the world. I'm startled at seeing what's happening in Africa, in Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, South Africa, Namibia. I'm getting correspondence every day from through social media, through hundreds and hundreds of people who are part of networks who want to hear about the Torah. Now, why is this happening? What we are seeing is, I would say, the beginnings of another huge leap forward by humanity in the direction of God's ultimate will. Just like there had been huge shifts millennia ago, in the time of Moses, suddenly a relatively small group of people got up out of Egypt, went into the wilderness, and decided from now on we're going to rest every seventh day, we are not going to eat certain species, we're going to do this and that. And a whole lot of people ever since have been trying to follow that pathway. Why did it happen? Why was it that suddenly, in the time of King David, the influence of Judah and the Torah spread across the Middle East, from what is today Turkey down to Egypt, across to Iraq? Why was that sudden shift, so that when his son Solomon came to the throne in Jerusalem and built the first temple, the entire region, according to the Bible, was a place of peace, prosperity, and the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge of God? Well, now the explosions of culture in Greece and in Rome subsequently, and through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, each one has involved leaders whose message bypassed the establishments but actually got to the real people. And that's how all historical change really has happened, and certainly cultural change. And even today, where most of the world is under the hypnosis of the mass media, nevertheless, a lot of young people are smart enough to realize that it's all lies and falsehood and hypnosis, and that's not where the truth lies. So I think this is how we must understand the new Jerusalem that people have been praying for and singing about and visioning for hundreds and hundreds of years and millennia. It comes like the dawn. The dawn doesn't, you don't turn on the light. I mean, most people are asleep through the beauty of the dawn, but from the pitch black of night to the full light of 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, very gradual development. And the unity of God means that light can only be revealed out of darkness. Light alone is meaningless without some receiver that was in darkness. And so it is inevitable that the revelation of the true Jerusalem on earth, with the peace it will bring, will be accompanied, as prophesied in Zechariah, as prophesied in Ezekiel, with ructions, with wars, with military advances, but it will be through the power of people's faith, through the power of people conquering their own hearts, controlling the lust and evil in their own hearts, that this will actually come about. The war has to be the inner jihad, if I might put it, against our own evil side. Not that you indiscriminately kill others. That's a war that God hates. The real war is when a person gets themselves under control to lead the way of life that God wants us to lead. And as we tell our friends and our families, our brothers and sisters, this will grow and swell, and that is why the heavenly Jerusalem will come to dwell on earth in stages. So it comes from heaven, and it's built by man. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the outstanding Hasidic luminary of the 1800s, born a little after Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO'S death in 1772, and also lived only 38 years, he called the building of the house the gathering of stones together, and the stones are the souls. It says in Lamentations how the precious stones are scattered in the filth on the streets. These are the souls. And you have to gather them in and cleanse them and put them together again so that the souls form community. So the spiritual house is the house of the community of people who are anxious to know and to serve God. So this is how we contribute to the heavenly process of bringing the temple down, by building it through our sound, pure, true friendships and fellowships and connections and communities, spreading this message to the whole world. Were Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO'S teachings accepted by his contemporaries? Were they accepted by his students? Are they coming to be accepted today? Well, in his time in Italy, he was persecuted. He was forced actually to conceal the manuscript about the temple, and it was not known to his contemporaries, was not known at all until 1956, when the professor from the Hebrew University found the manuscript in the Oxford Bodleian Library. Since that time, the very fine edition of Rabbi Chaim Friedlander has without question enabled the Torah scholarly community to experience and know these writings. And these are writings which, like a treatise on algebra or geometry, you can't quarrel with, because it's all mathematically perfect. It all fits together perfectly. The words of Ezekiel are accepted by everybody as Holy Writ. And here comes Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO, who shows you that this Holy Writ has this mathematical dimension. You cannot quarrel with it. And that's why outstanding rabbis all accept this. How you get to the future temple is a point of a difference of views among different groups. Are we supposed to already start sacrificing? Are we supposed to educate the public? What should we do? But acceptance that this is the ultimate destiny is universal among rabbinical scholars. To bring it to the wider world, I think really this is one of the missions of our time. That was why I did my edition of the Mishkanei Elyon, the Supreme Sanctuaries, in the English book Secrets of the Future Temple, of which I sent copies to the President of the United States and to the heir to the throne of Britain and Northern Ireland, and to other figures, in the hope that it would catch on. But it certainly has its what you might call underground readership. Since the publication of my work, a very beautiful edition about the Temple of Ezekiel, the prophecy, going through verse by verse with the Hebrew translation, with the Hebrew original, with the English translation, and with the relevant explanations of Rabbi Moshe Chaim LUZZATTO, has been brought out by Rabbi Chaim Chlorfin, who lives in Tzfat. And the beauty of his book is that it has full-scale illustrations and photographs of his own handmade, beautifully constructed model of Ezekiel's temple, which is actually exhibited in the center of the city of Tzfat, right by the cave of Shem and Aver. So Rabbi Chaim Chlorfin's book on the Temple of Ezekiel is another stage in manifesting this future temple. And every day I see pictures of buildings going up around the world, in Bahrain and in Brazil, and in unbelievable edifices. Well, I think it's just a matter of time that this will eventually become totally viral, and everybody will be able to see that the form of this temple is really what should be the mandala of the whole world in the future. And at the end of days, it will indeed be the place to which all the eyes of people across the earth are directed. There are two traditions among the Jewish Torah sages about how the future temple comes into the world. According to one tradition, it is built by humans. According to others, it comes down from heaven. These would appear to be two mutually exclusive ways of having a building take shape, but I think they're not mutually exclusive, because before people are going to be impelled to do anything about it, they first have to get the bright idea. And bright ideas don't just come out of the mind randomly, but the Almighty sends to his key chosen people the idea of the moment which is going to catch on. So I think the way one could understand the concept of the temple coming down from heaven is not like a sort of almighty, coming down out of space and whamming into the Temple Mount. That would be truly horrendous, and I don't think that that is the meaning of the prophecy of the earthquake in Zechariah 14. I think the idea is that what comes down from God is what comes into the soul of people. These new realizations that begin to dawn upon people when one historical age gives way to the new age, when people think entirely, just as people today think entirely differently from the way they did 50 or 100 years ago. So there will come a time when all of these fads today will be out, and into people's souls from heaven will come what God wants at the end of all this terrible scourge of bloodshed and intimidation and hatred and literally curses and the agriculture and the bee colonies and all God will eventually have compassion on us and bring down from heaven the blueprint that people will then realize. It stands to reason. Years ago I had a conversation with an Arab man that was driving a taxi I was traveling with, and I said to him, you know that before the Golden Dome Mosque on the Temple Mount of Jerusalem was even built, there had originally stood there the temple of King Solomon. He said, of course, everybody knows that. There was a private conversation at the time, and I said, well, we know that the Temple of Solomon, because it was built by mortals, could not endure forever and eventually was destroyed. And I said to him, well, the very beautiful mosque that stands there today, is it conceivable that one day it will also be tired and worn out? He said, yes, of course, it's obvious. And so we both agree that actually there will come a time when a new structure will need to be erected there. So what are they going to do? Have a competition of architects to see who's going to design it? It's already there. The whole thing has already been given from heaven by God to Ezekiel, and all that's needed now is to realize this structurally with what we already have available, and which will, God willing, be available, will most certainly be available when the time comes. And that way, it comes down from heaven through the mathematics, through the dimensions, and is embodied in stone as this world's offering to God. Do I think the temple is going to be rebuilt in our time? I don't even concern myself with that. I follow what happens on and around the Temple Mount. As the older I get, I realize that it's basically being recycled year after year, and the same old things are. And I just personally leave the diplomacy to the diplomats and the politics to the politicians. And I think that the important work for ordinary, down-to-earth people is to build the temple stone by building souls, bringing souls together, building families, building communities. And when the time comes that God wants it, I have the arrogance that it must be built in 10 minutes' time while I'm here. Am I worthy of this? Have I cleansed myself? Do I understand what it means to have a temple in our midst? It would be unthinkable that in the contemporary 21st century of Jerusalem, with its shops and its bars and its taverns and the trading and the money-making going around the temple, it's inconceivable that this will happen without a huge shake-up. We do not want money-makers in the temple or around the temple. We want the temple as a place that is above money and corruption, that is above all the lies we're being daily fed. We want a place of purity. So if we want it enough, we have to work towards it by bringing truth into ourselves, by bringing love into ourselves, by really practicing the love we preach with our actual people around us, with the actual people we encounter, and this is how we will build it. Let's ask ourselves what the future temple prophesied by Ezekiel is really like inside it, and is it so very different from the temple of King Solomon, which is set forth in Book of Kings, or from the second temple, which we know about from tractate measurements and other sources? Well, the basic structure of the temple, what happens in the temple, are the same. The real center, it's like a house. Where's the center of the house? Every woman knows the center of the house is the kitchen. And the temple courtyard is really a kitchen. There's the butchers who are preparing the meat. They're the portions that go on the altar. They're the portions that are eaten by the priests who are the officiating here. And the altar is situated. You don't have a smoking altar inside your house. You have the fire pile outside the house, and the house is a place of tranquility and beauty. The future temple is, in terms of its structure, the same as the first and the second temples. It has, when you enter through a great portico with a very wide and tall entrance. You come into the holy, where you see ahead of you the table of the showbread, the incense altar, and the menorah candelabrum, and 10 of each, as in King Solomon's temple. And beyond that is something that you cannot see, that you can only think about and envisage, which is the Holy of Holies, which will, in the future temple, contain the returned Ark of the Covenant, the golden ark with its cover of 2 cherubs with their wings extended, all pure gold, which, according to our sages, was hidden away 3 generations before the destruction of the first temple by King Josiah in the great revival that happened in his time. So the Ark of the Covenant is to be restored, and to expect to be able to sort of march through this with tour guides holding their umbrellas to keep their flocks is unthinkable. I mean, I think one has to think about this more like the kind of sort of alien planet that you find on, Star Trek, where there's this whole place where there are actually people in white robes and officiating in ceremonies. I mean, people will have to learn a lot about what is going on there before they can really begin to understand it. Most certainly, the people are to pass through. In Ezekiel, in chapter there in the later chapter, he speaks about how people will go in through the north gate and pass through to the south gate, or go from the south to the north, and that is very important. That's the real significance of this place. North and south represent 2 opposing forces that have to cooperate: kindness and discipline. Because kindness requires discipline, and discipline requires kindness, and they have to function together. So if you come in from the north, discipline, you've got to go through to the south, kindness. If you go from the south, kindness, you've got to go up to the north to learn to balance and reconcile the opposites. And what will be visually most striking is that this will become the iconic center of earth, which will be a cube. It will be a mighty cubic structure. Now, in this, the future temple of Ezekiel differs somewhat from the temple of King Solomon and the second temple. The future temple is all cubes and squares, square courtyards around it, and that in itself, that is the teaching. The teaching is that you're entering in a place which is geometrically designed to inculcate into our hearts the concepts of balance and tolerance cooperation between opposites. That is the lesson, because that is what the whole repair of the world requires. That we don't fight each other, but we cooperate with each other. So those will be visually the key elements of the future temple. Will Jerusalem change when this temple comes into the world, and will the surroundings change? Well, this again is all elusively brought to us in the closing chapters of Ezekiel, because after the virtual tour of the future temple comes the whole disposition of the lands of the 12 tribes of Israel and the priests and the Levites in the future order. But now this is going to be very surprising to some people who think that the present day political geography of the Middle East is set in time, in stone, and can never be changed. It's only been here for less than a century still, and it's going to change radically, because according to Ezekiel and according to the Torah in the end of Book of Numbers, the northern boundary of the promised land of the 12 tribes of Israel is in a town well known to readers of the Bible, a town called Antioch. Antioch, which is in present-day Turkey, Antiki, is actually pretty much at the northern end of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, and that is the northern boundary of the land promised to the 12 tribes, and it goes all the way down to Nachal Mitzrayim, the stream of Egypt, which is at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. Now, all of that land is portioned between the 12 tribes as delineated in chapter 47 of Ezekiel, and the disposition of Jerusalem with the areas for the temple, for the priests, and for all of their needs is all in the chapters 43, 44, 45. It speaks about all of this and the clothes of the priests and so on. Well, now how this fits in with the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway and with the Malcha shopping center and with Ramot and Giloh and Talpiot and the contemporary Jerusalem, I have absolutely no idea. I do know that in the time of the Second Temple, we know from our Mishnah that industry was not allowed in the holy city of Jerusalem. You don't have like smoke belching forth near God's sanctuary, and you don't have rowdiness, you don't have all kinds of other things which scar our urban landscapes today. Well, we are still waiting for all this and to see how it's going to actually come. But again, if we will start building the New Jerusalem in our own homes, in our own precincts, and with our own friends and associates, that's how it'll spread.